While Standard still raises many questions to ponder, we've got a whole new set to conquer.
It only stops if it exhausts. Comment below as we walk through the final week of Foundation Standard. Alrighty, gang. This season ended with 15 major tournaments covering 120 top 8 slots. Esper Pixies came in first, snagging 18 top 8s and 4 trophies, which was good for 15% of the meta share roughly, and nearly a third of the available hardware. With Aetherdrift giving Pixies metaphorical nitrous for next season's race, it'll be a series contender once more, but more on that in a moment.
Gruul Aggro maintained its status as a second pillar of the format to end the season, rocking 15 top 8s and a trophy of its own. That said, with the rest of the field getting plenty of new tools in Aetherdrift, will the mighty mice of Bloomborough find a ride to the future or be left in the dust?
Dimir Bounce House rattled off 13 top 8s and 3 trophies to finish the season on a positive note. Whether this archetype is stronger than Pixies is going to be the big question for Aetherdrift Standard, and we've got some thoughts.
Yeah, and rounding out Tier 1 archetypes is Golgari Midrange. Vaulting from being the trap deck of the format to one of the most efficient midrange lists in a meta defined by the 3 decks still ahead of it, Golgari managed to end the final week with 12 top 8s and 3 trophies. Will this archetype get the final pieces it needs to dominate with Aetherdrift sliding into town? There's plenty of road left to travel.
Xur's Domain kicks off our Tier 2 archetypes with 11 top 8s and 1 shiny piece of hardware. Domain has struggled to find its footing in a tempo-based metagame, but it feels like it's closing in on cracking that code. Aetherdrift might just have the last boost it needs to cross the finish line with regularity next season.
And Jeskai Convoke grabbed 9 top 8s and a trophy to end its season in 6th place. The Swarm strategy saw a massive resurgence with the top 3 decks all struggling to answer Swarm-based strategies. For those who are curious, this is also why Selesnya Cage was doing so well for a weekend or two. Now, while this archetype may always have a glaring weakness to sweepers, it's proven that anything less is insufficient to contain it, which keeps it around week to week. Aetherdrift might have a few fun toys for this speed demon of an archetype as well.
Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Dimir Tempo got bounced all the way back to 7th place to end the season with 4 top 8s and a trophy. I believe we finally answered the question of whether bounce-based Dimir was stronger than Tempo, and the player base of this archetype is swiftly eroding in favor of the new upgraded bounce spells. I don't see Aetherdrift giving this archetype enough new tools to change that equation, but we're going to have to wait and see, Max.
Yeah, and finally, coming in 8th place and ending our tier list for Foundation Standard is Bant Toxic? Ooh, back from the dead and ready for battle once more like their Phyrexian overlords would want. 3 top 8s and a trophy kickstarted this archetype's engines and got a few of you far too excited for the deck you love to hate. A fitting finale for Foundation Standard.
Drifting on over to Brewer's Corner, we'll take a look at the futures of Standard by starting with some Aetherdrift brews of our own. I'll be featuring a Selesnya Cage update and a fresh Cauldron brew in Temur.
And I'll be highlighting a Rakdos Lizards update and Selesnya Shipyard. Now, let's start the countdown with Esper Pixies.
Fire Shoes, I know you guys know who that is, took down a 24-player RCQ in Iowa this past Saturday with Esper Pixies, cementing the archetype's position at the top. And let's see what this deck stands to gain from Aetherdrift, because I feel like at this point we all kind of know what's in it, right? So first and foremost, we're going to talk about this card over and over and over again today, and it's not even a rare. Spell Pierce, it's back. Have you tried landing a 4-mana spell through Spell Pierce? It's not easy. This is a deck that is all about momentum, and Spell Pierce really gives it that edge over any of the mid-range control piles that are Wrath heavy. Second card to look at, Grim Bauble. Bounceable Stab seems like a no-brainer against Gruul. We don't know if it goes in the main necessarily, but imagine this. You get to go turn 1 Bauble, turn 2 Pixie Bounce Bauble, replay Bauble. Do you see how Gruul Mice is going to struggle with that line, and how many other archetypes are going to struggle with that line? Last but not least, Momentum Breaker, bounceable edict that triggers Entity Tracker and eventually can be sacrificed for a little extra life. It feels kind of inevitable, Max, that we're going to get at least 1 copy going into this list.
All right, well, Pixies getting new tools is kind of upsetting, like it needs them, but what are we really looking for from Aetherdrift to kind of usurp Pixies' place at the top? Like, what are the other decks going to need to find and have for Pixies to finally stop being the number 1 deck?
probably a nice ban, but in lieu of a ban, I really think it's going to come down to finding where Pixies is positioned week to week and figuring out how you can attack that positioning, right? Like, are they going to stick with Hopeless Nightmare now that they have baubles and momentum breakers, or do they just go heavy anti-aggro? Do we have the ability to go into control and just make half the cards in their deck dead now? I think that's going to be a big piece of it, because if you look at the efficiency of Pixies, Max, it's not an easy deck to break. You can't rely against a deck like that on any one particular strategy, because it has the ability to shift and become a deck that can deal with most of the strategies, especially now that there's Spell Pierce in the format. But it can't beat everything all at once. So wherever it's hedged, we want to be on the other end of that. And that's going to be a big question mark week to week.
Certainly, very oppressive deck for the standard meta, but no one deck can beat them all. I think standard is still, despite the fact that Bounce is at the top, still in a place where we're going to see that rock paper scissors dynamic go on, especially now that the new set's released. So let's talk about the other pillar of the format, Gruul Aggro.
Pat Zero Presidente won a 61-player MTGO challenge on Saturday with Gruul Aggro using the Leyline iteration rather than the grindy Innkeeper's Talent build. And again, let's take a look at what new tools Aetherdrift has for this archetype. There's not a whole lot. I'm going to be dead honest with you. I'm very curious about Grease Wrench Goblin, because if we're not worried about a bunch of 1/1s in the format, this card is Savannah Lions on crack with card filtering for the late game. I doubt it's going to replace anything like a Hired Claw, and obviously not in this list. But he might end up wanting a single copy as kind of a weird one-drop competing with Kellen for the ability to filter as the game goes on. That said, why I really wanted to focus in on Leyline of Resonance is that this is a weird way to attack Pixies, because it's a way to try and get under it, and unless they adopt into the Grim Bauble playstyles and momentum breakers, this is the kind of deck that really gives them fits, especially when you're able to plot those slick shots and just hold them and force your opponent to hold up removal, turn in and turn out, and not advance their board state. So this is one of those lines that I wanted to highlight, despite the fact that Aetherdrift isn't giving it much.
Yeah, which brings me to my question. Do you see the other red-based archetypes coming back in a big way because of that? Like, for example, is there anything in Boros colors that's coming down the pipeline that might bring that red-based deck back?
I mean, Boros finally got its Verge, right? So we know that the mana base finally improved, and that was a big piece of what was holding it up. But does it actually work to play the deck with Shard Mage's Rescue against the deck with nowhere to run? I think that that gets troublesome, because that's really what that deck was relying on to beat the mirror and to hedge against all the black-based mid-range decks. But then they all went into nowhere to run, and we watched Boros Aggro just get pushed out of the format entirely. So is a Verge enough to bring it back? I don't think so. But it could also get some other tools. There's some new interesting tools coming in. I believe one of them's the vehicle, the 4/2 Trampler, Gastel something. Anyway, that card is fascinating to me for mono red and for Boros, because you have a difficult to answer threat that comes back out of the graveyard and hits again. And that's kind of like a vehicle version of Ball Lightning with Reanimate, which is fascinating. So I'm curious to see some of these new aggressive red cards and whether or not they can find a home in any of the red-based builds, because I don't know if it's going to be Gruul, I don't know if it's going to be Boros, I don't know if it's going to be mono red, but I'm guessing one of those three is going to emerge, and we have to figure out which one.
Certainly. And let's talk about a deck now that's going through the colors are going through a bit of an identity crisis. Dimir Bounce.
Sorry if I butcher the name. Stefano Conclini beat Domain in the finals of a 46-player RCQ in Italy on Sunday, clinching yet another trophy for Dimir Bounce time. The future is bright for this archetype, but what does it gain this weekend? Let's take a look. Once more, Spell Pierce. Yeah, that card's going to keep getting talked about. Grim Bauble, also going to keep getting talked about. Momentum Breaker, also going to keep getting talked about. Like, you see these three cards are every Bounce deck's dream. So we're going to see these get talked about as people are trying to figure it out. There's a couple other cards that are worth noting. Last Ride. It's only like $3 right now, and it's a mythic rare. I'm getting it as a prop bet regardless, because I remember when Death Shadow was printed, and I will say and take credit as the one who broke Death Shadow first in Modern. That card was super undervalued for a very long time. This isn't as good. I know that. It's not going to be as good. However, have you tried to play against a deck that's trying to chip damage the whole time, which is honestly what that that mirror match can look like, where they get you down to like 6 or 5 life, and all of a sudden the last ride is going to be this 6-6 to 10-10 that just cracks back if they're not careful. So I think that's interesting, and the fact that it gives you card advantage while improving its own stat line is a fascinating aspect to it. I think it's worth grabbing a copy while it's cheap.
I think so too. I think that's a very intriguing card, especially for the matchup with Esper, which leads me to my question. Do you think Dimir now has the tools to usurp Esper as the premier bounce deck?
So there's a weird option that nobody's really investigating right now that I think Dimir's going to want to look at, which is Bloodghast. And a lot of people look at that and they're like, okay, why do you want to play Bloodghast? Well, how do you deal with that in the bounce mirror? How do you deal with that against Esper Pixies? Because you can't know where to run it. You can't Grimbobble it. Hopeless Nightmare is basically just getting it into play for free on turn 1. So it's like the obstinate Baloth of Dimir and Pixies. And I do think that gives Dimir Bounce an edge that it didn't previously have, because they needed something like that. I don't know if it's good enough, because it's still only a 2-1, but the fact of the matter is it exists now. Let's also look at the fact that Quag Feast exists, and that card blows up Kaido. They don't have Enduring Curiosity and Pixie, they have Kaido. So if you can blow up their top end, that's pretty important.
Okay. Well, we'll have to see week 1 how that matchup plays out across all the events. But talk to us about a rising archetype, which might have a good place now in Aetherdrift, Golgari Midrange.
Lucas G1GGs beat Gruul Aggro in the finals of a 50-player MTGO challenge last Thursday, lifting the curse of Golgari being a trap deck and turning it into a viable contender instead. Back to Tier 1 at long last, and it feels so right. What does this get from Aetherdrift? Well, the last ride is also a card I'm looking at for this deck. I think it's got a lot of merit. Having another 1-drop that scales as the game goes on, allows you to grind in the mirror. It's only a 1-of, but it is viable. Bloodghast, again, this is a card that we can look at on top of Baloth to just say, do you really want to run Hopeless Nightmare into this deck? Try me, you know? Speed Demon. Is Unholy Annex coming back now that we have another demon and this one also draws cards? I don't know. Speed Demon's pretty slow in a bounce meta, but if you get to go Shelly into Speed Demon, now you've got a lot of life gain pushed while you're drawing cards. So that's fascinating. Last but not least, you're going to hear this card over and over again, Quag Feast. This card is probably going in as a 2-of in a lot of these decks, over 1 to 2 copies of Go for the Throat, because you need to diversify the removal, especially with all these vehicles coming in. If any of them are good, Go for the Throat gets a lot worse. So you want something like Quag Feast to say, okay, we need to be able to blow up artifacts. I know it's a little difficult because it's sorcery speed against vehicles. Take it with a grain of salt. But you are able to answer some things that you otherwise can't easily answer, and Kaido is at the top of that list still.
Absolutely, it is. Yeah. So my question to you: does Aetherdrift sort of leave Golgari where it was before, where it's a pile of good mid-range cards, but no distinct strategy, or do you see a strategy forming around Golgari colors?
Well, I think Golgari improves. The mana base improves. You get the Verge finally. That's great. You get Debris Beetle if you want, and it is still kind of a pile of good cards. But I think the difference that we're seeing from the beginning of the season to the present is that those good cards now aren't defined strictly by being what in a vacuum would be defined as the best, but what is instead the best given what the metagame is. For instance, in a vacuum, Glissa is better than Sentinel, but Sentinel is way better in a nowhere to run meta, right? So we're seeing upgrades in that sense, where we're taking cards that are not focused but powerful, and we're shifting to cards that are focused specifically for the metagame, and that gives Golgari the ability to play good stuff deck, you know?
Yeah. That's absolutely fair, and definitely an improvement over what was going on in that archetype before. So I look forward to seeing what cards get selected week 1 for event top 8 results, and see if Golgari makes it. But that does it for Tier 1. Let's jump down to Tier 2, where I'll start things by talking about Xur's Domain. So Riley LBJ smashed through a 67-player MTGO challenge on Sunday with Xur's Domain, taking down the mirror in the finals. How exciting. But let's fast forward to Aetherdrift, see what couple of cards this archetype stands to gain. I'll be honest, the deck is pretty tight, right? Xur's Domain is a deck that has tight margins in terms of what you want to include. So I only have a couple of cards for you. I think Ride Zen I think you do want that card. It's an upgrade from Seized by Slumber, exiling something at 2 mana, triggering your Beanstalk. Yeah, include a playset. I think this is a very cool card to have in this deck. One card that allows me to dream pretty big that I like is March of the World Ooze. Look, if Bounce somehow exits the meta, right, if the stars align, and we could have a new strong top end card for this deck, why not? Making your white overlord tokens 6/6 flyers, that would be really amazing, especially, being able to do something every single time your opponent casts a spell. I mean, that's amazing. But aside from those two, not much new to the archetype. I think this archetype is just going to keep smashing through Aetherdrift the way it presently is.
Absolutely. Now, I look at that list, Max, and I see the temporary lockdowns, and I have to ask, are we concerned about running temporary lockdown against Pixie and Bounce decks that can gain value by bouncing it in and off the battlefield?
I definitely am. I know I am personally. I personally prefer Pyroclasm. I've said that before, especially if you're running the version of Domain with the red Overlord as opposed to the blue Overlord. If you don't want to go that route, be prepared to run instead more copies of Day of Judgment at the 4-drop slot. But I personally would rather run Pyroclasm.
I'm with you. Lockdown feels like one hell of a risk to be taken right now in a bounce meta, but maybe they're seeing something we aren't. Nonetheless, let's talk about a deck that Lockdown absolutely houses, Jeskai Convoke.
Whew. All right, Jeskai Convoke. Back, baby. Jake Swales won a 40-player RCQ in Wales with, wow, that rhymes.
Right?
Jeskai Convoke, taking down Amir in the finals as well. Let's drift on through the Aether and see what's in store for it coming next week. The first thing I got to point out is we got the Verge. We got the Verge, baby. That's going to help the mana base tremendously in your Jeskai builds. You might be tempted to run this deck as Boros, right? But you'll be missing out on the next card, Spell Pierce. Spell Pierce, keeping board wipes at bay is what we need to do for this swarm strategy to work. And that's the weakness of Convoke, is it dies to Sunfall, it dies the Day of Judgment, right? It dies a temporary lockdown. So having that just be accessible is going to be huge for this archetype. I think this archetype gets finally earns a place at least in tier 2 because of this. Also, something to keep in mind is that turn 2 Gleeful Demolition play. If you have the right mana, it can keep your opponent from destroying your artifact target, your artifact creature, reversing the spell, whatever. But your Gleeful Demolition play looks a lot better now into Knight Errant of Eos. And then also, I just want to say Diversion Unit, that's kind of an iffy card. Maybe it sees some sideboard play. It doesn't slot in really well at 2 mana, but that's also another card that can kind of help put off the board wipe.
So, Max, you briefly mentioned the Verge, and we know Verges can't come in on the 3 mana builds because you just don't have enough basic lands for them to work. But if we go to that 2-color build, that Boros build that previously didn't have the mana it wanted because it was missing that Verge, are we able to drop out, the Protect the Negotiators, the Mockingbirds, the Spyglass Sirens, flip it down to Boros, and find a viable path for this deck? Or is that just a pipe dream for those of us who are like, Wraths don't exist, we don't need counterspells?
I would love to think that Boros Convoke could be a thing again. I ran it into the ground for a year, but no, sadly no. It may be good for a hot run on ladder and arena, right? Especially when players first week are focused on just developing their own aggro strategies and really not interacting with their opponents. But in a paper event, they're going to come ready. So it's already going to take some side hate because of Gruul being in the format. I think Spell Pierce is just really too good to miss out on, so I think you want to go Jeskai for Convoke.
Yeah, it's hard to walk away from Spell Pierce, and that is a theme we are going to see over and over and over again. Speaking of decks that love Spell Pierce, Dimir Tempo.
Alessandro Dolce took down a 21-player RCQ in Magdeburg, Germany this past Saturday with Dimir Tempo, keeping the archetype alive as we close out Foundation Standard. Let's look to the future and what might be added from Aetherdrift. Thopter Fabricator. Nobody's really talked about this card, but 4/4 flyers that pair well with Kaido, Curiosity, Preacher. That's very intriguing. Bloodghast has to get a mention here. Especially because Hopeless Nightmare is still out there. It plays terribly into this card. The Last Ride, variable sideboard option maybe. We're bringing this one up because it's a good counterpunch to aggro decks. Quag Feast, 2 mana to kill basically all the viable creatures, planeswalkers that might just make the cut for diversification of removal. I mean, you need that in your deck. So Spell Pierce, again, I won't say too much about it, but Spell Pierce fits in here as well. And then something that's been brought up by other Rebellion Guild mages, and we've been talking about in the Discord, is the Oil Deep Gear Hulk. This might actually see play over Curiosity post-board against aggro, so be on the lookout for it, especially since the price might go up on this card.
Yeah, I'm going to get my playset pretty quick, Max, because they're only $10 right now, and that card looks like it might be the runaway favorite from this set. That said, can Dimir Tempo compete in a world of Esper Pixie and Dimir Bounce, or does it just get outclassed by the synergy and the overall power level of those two?
I think Dimir Tempo does get out-tempoed by Bounce. Not to sound too redundant there, but yeah, it does. Now, while it does have the raw power in a Gruul meta and an aggro meta, it does get outdone by those Bounce archetypes, and so long as they're there, Dimir Tempo is going to run into issues. Much like how we saw Golgari Annex successful for a while, and then it came to be outplayed by leaner versions of Golgari, and then even leaner decks like Dimir Tempo, for example. This deck will also need to transform, or maybe we see Dimir artifacts slot in. I don't know. We'll see.
That's fair. Now, let's look at a list that just went under all the bounce decks and said, do you really want to bounce a Venerated Rot Priest? Bant Toxic, baby.
So Christian Baker navigated through a 20-player field at the 2-slot RCQ in Rochester, New York with Bant Toxic. Love it or hate it, Toxic is back and ready for action. I can definitely see why. Let's see if Aetherdrift has any additional tools for the archetype, and I have to report, right, the first one you could suspect, Spell Pierce. This aggro deck needs Spell Pierce to work and to continue to function. I mean, look, it's a huge addition, in particular for Toxic, because, your opponent's going to target your Rot Priest. They're gonna be happy with taking a poison counter to get rid of it, and then they don't get to get rid of it. So that's a huge momentum boost for Bant Toxic, especially in the early turns. And then I just want to mention the Bright Glass Gear Hulk here. Mana requirements are kind of heavy for a low curve aggro, but if you're snagging 2 Rot Priests, that's powerful. You can grab Mockingbird, Shard Mage's Rescue, Ghost Vacuum if you need it. So I like the inclusion of Bright Glass Gear Hulk here. We'll see if testing with that works. But outside of these two, the deck is pretty much unchanged. It's already got some really good tools to get around the opponent and to get those 10 poison counters in, regardless of whether your opponent gummies up the board or not.
So, Max, why do you think we had a resurgence of Toxic at the end of the season? Like, it was gone for basically all of Foundation Standard. We didn't see a damn piece of it until the end, and then it just came in with like a late rush to the finish. Why is that?
I have to say, it's because Rot Priest itself sits really pretty in a meta filled with Bounce, right? Toxic has the tools to subvert the bigger decks, the go big mid-range decks, but it really scoffs at Bounce. Like, whether it's getting around Nowhere to Run with Aspirant's Ascent, or, bouncing other things with Serum Snare, or using Skrelv when they present like a problematic blocker, or copying a Rot Priest with Mockingbird, this deck has the tools to get there relatively quickly, especially when you compare it to the other aggro decks. So yeah, don't sleep on Bant Toxic. I think there's a reason we saw it surge, and that's because aggro is back.
I mean, that's fair. That's fair. If we're going to see the bounce decks running around, Rot Priest just keeps looking spicy. But with that, we're going to move on to the future. We're going to take a look at Brewer's Corner, and we got a special one for you guys, because today we're going to look at what happens if you add in Aetherdrift. Let's start with a little Rakdos Lizards update, Max.
All right, so mind us while we use Mox Field for these so we can show off the new cards. We have first up Rakdos Lizards by Darth Riktus. Now, we did feature a Rakdos Lizards deck in the past, and it introduced us to Alicia. Alicia is still a spicy card. I like the idea of reanimating these low curve creatures every time you attack, especially when you get bonuses for bringing lizards into play. The new card here is Gastal Thrillseeker, giving you a bonus damage on ETB. Gets your speed to 2 right away. It's very easy to get to max speed with this card, just a couple of copies. With this being a possible reanimation target, you'll be pinging for damage many times. You're setting up your Fireglass Mentor to get you more card advantage, so I like where this card is placed here. We also have Quag Feast, which presents a strong piece of removal, specifically in this shell, where you are going to have things in your graveyard. You are going to have creatures die off. So Quag Feast has has the potential to be a good piece of removal. 2 in the main, 2 in the side. I like that balance here. Other than that, these 2 pieces, it really Rakdos listers just need a couple pieces to be a deck again. So, I expect this might make tier 2 in the first couple of weeks. We shall see.
Yeah, it's one of those decks that has always struggled with wrath effects, but when the world is all about bounce, wrath effects are not to be found. Like you're just not going to see as many wrath effects if we're going to see a world filled with Esper Pixie running around, and that gives this deck a lot of legs. So I don't know that it's necessarily tier 1, but I think it can make a run at the tier 1 decks, and that's spicy going into this. That said, I'm going to kick things off on the next one with an update to that Selesnya Cage list. All right, gang, so Bright Glass Gear Hulk. Buy these now. I'm just going to say it. Just buy them now. They're $10. Get them before they spike. It's a mythic rare. It tutors. Cards that tutor for artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. I don't care if you never play it in Standard, and you probably will still play it in Standard. There will be an older format that finds this and goes, oh, that gets me the combo. And it's going to be important. We don't know where that is yet. We don't know where it fits in yet. You're not going to know where it fits in yet because it's, week 0. But for this deck, what does it do? Well, you get to grab Basilisk Collar, Duskrose Reliquaries, and all the Pop Hatch recruits your heart desires. And then post-board, you get to go grab Ghost Vacuum with it. So in a weird way, you're getting to upgrade the amount of graveyard hate you have post-board, and pre-board, Basilisk Collar on a Bright Glass Gear Hulk is incredibly difficult for most decks to deal with. At that point, you're going to have, First Strike, Trample, Death Touch, and Lifelink all on a 5/5? Or 4/4? Yeah. No, that is damn near impossible to get through. The Duskrose Reliquary is there because we're playing tokens. Why wouldn't we have a removal spell that we can tutor with Bright Glass?
Wow. Okay, I'm excited for Cage.
Same. It's a fascinating list. I got to know if it actually works. I already ordered the Gear Hulk, so I'm like, I don't know. One way or another, that Oil Deep, Bright Glass, those 2 Gear Hulks to me run away best ones in the set so far. And with that, though,
I agree.
Let's look at Selesnya Shipyard for all the other vehicles.
All right. I brought up a few weeks ago the fact that this card exists widely. Duke, Arlen Hero, however you pronounce it. Anyway, from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, this card is going to see play. It's relevant. Being able to gain 1 life, draw a card whenever you saddle with this or crew with this is amazing, honestly. We got a new 1-drop in Voyager Glidecar. I think this is very aggressive for a 1-drop, right? You get to scry when it comes in. It has a very low crew amount. But if you're tapping the other creatures to, give it, its artifact and flying status, that's pretty heavy. That's a guaranteed attacker that's for 1 mana. Also, another 1-drop District Mascot. We're gonna have a heavy artifact meta, so being able to remove those counters, not even to sacrifice it, but just remove 2 of the 1/1 counters to destroy an artifact is pretty powerful in my opinion. Bulwark Ox, also something that this archetype needed. I know we're still in a meta with Sunfall, but outside of Sunfall, being able to protect against the board wipes is really critical for these. Similar to how Convoke has Spell Pierce, this deck needed Bulwark Ox. The rest of it, several vehicles. You got Tumblewagon here, Thorndurst Velocipede, and I love the hover ship. Just being able to remove, and also, you're going up. It's almost a 2-for-1. You're going up on another creature, also removing a piece off the opponent's board. So, very cool cards. And then before I turn it over to you, Web Strike Elite, I think that card is going to see play in a lot of different decks and a lot of different sideboards. I think that's the new anti-artifact, anti-enchantment piece.
Well, and Max, I love that this vehicle list looks at Sunfall and goes, okay, maybe you're getting a 2-for-1, but not more than that, because we have all these vehicles you're not hitting with Sunfall. And I don't think people can afford to flip from Sunfall over to the new Wrath that hits the vehicles because Exile is too important right now. So you're looking at a meta where Sunfall is getting a lot worse because of all of these vehicles that are coming in that it just dodge it, right? But
yeah, absolutely.
We'll move ahead to the brand new combo iteration, Temur Cauldron. It's back, baby. Let's talk about it. All right, for those who are not aware, here is the combo that goes with this list. You have a Sleep Cursed Fairy. It needs 1 and a blue to untap. You have Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which allows you to exile these creatures out of your graveyard, and they get the activated abilities put onto other creatures, right? And then you have this beautiful, beautiful new card that just got printed called Red Rocket. I'm just going to call it that. It is a 2/3 with Vigilance, and where it says tap, add X mana of any one color where X is red shift's power. If you put this under a cauldron on Sleep Cursed Fairy, you have infinite mana. Infinite mana. That simple, right? Turn 1 Fairy, turn 2 Cauldron, turn 3, you just got to find a way to get this into your graveyard. Maybe they Hopeless Nightmared and helped you, and now turn 2 you have infinite mana potentially in this format. Now you can only spend it to activate abilities, so that limits what we can do with it. However, what do we have for abilities? Well, we got Bristly Bill with infinite mana. You are going to have infinite power and toughness on that creature from Soul Cauldron. You also get to flip Rona and make it infinite. And while you do that, and when you flip it, it now has Trample, which means it gets through with infinite power and toughness off of the Soul Cauldron plus Bristly Bill. Thrill Seeker allows you to throw it, so you at least have a way to not have to attack and just throw it right at their face. And then, of course, you have the Ronas and the Inties and the Dredger's Insights to go hunting for the pieces that you don't have. I think it's an interesting list. It needs a lot of work still. I'm not going to argue that point. It's very much the earliest iteration, but I'm fascinated by it, Max. Like, this is a deck that can get going way faster than the build with the Kami that used to just struggle so much. And I'm fascinated by a deck that can go off turn 3 with some regularity, you know?
Yeah, that's wild to me. And Thrill Seeker still being in the format is such a boon to Cauldron decks. So I'm interested to see how many builds of Temur Cauldron we get and what all you can do with it. I feel like there's a huge potential there.
Yeah, and to everybody who made Bristly Bill somehow $50, god damn it. God damn it. Why did you do that? Anyway, let's go ahead and move things a little bit further, get to our favorite segment after Brewer's Corner, Ahead of the Curve. Now, Max, we looked at, 12 different archetypes as per usual. What do you think is worth playing when we go into Aetherdrift? Week 1, RCQs are happening. I'm going to be at an RCQ that week. What do you recommend?
All right, so I want to go into low curve aggro. I've been toying with Azorius artifacts. So I think week 1 having an aggro deck is a very strong entry. While your opponents are trying to figure out their combos or their mid-range strategies, you're just jumping the gun, getting as many matches and sets in as possible, and beating the opponent quickly. This deck does that well. Obviously, we have access to Spell Pierce, which is great for any sort of swarm strategy. We also have access to Disruption Unit. This is an evasive target for Zoetic Glyph as well, in addition to being able to protect you from the board wipe. The Mendicant, the new legendary 2-drop, with the Nesting Bot, you've got a token creation engine and a strong body in that card. So I'll be interested to see how wide you can go with this card and what else we can do with this deck. But I think Zoetic Glyph is placing well here. You've got life gain from the new card Voyage Home. This might slot in better than Enduring Curiosity, to be honest. You get to draw your 3 cards, gain your 3 life, and that's it. You don't have to wait to attack. You don't have to make sure it sticks and doesn't get exiled. And also, like, Still Seraph is placed here as well with all the flying and evasive creatures. So I'm taking Azorius artifacts. I'm gonna keep tuning that deck and seeing what else I can do with it. Maybe we find some way to bring in Mockingbird, the Bunnicorn, some other pieces. But I feel like this basic build is where I'm gonna start.
Every part of me wants to put 4 Leyline Axe in that build and just go ham. So yeah, no, I feel you, because like, it's Azorius Cookies revamped, but like, Cookies got so many new pieces, Max, and I think you're right to go and investigate that, because there are so many new tools that you get to try with that deck. I love it. Now, that said, aggro, usually good week 1. I'm going to take the exact opposite approach. Let's talk a little bit about control. Oh yes, it's back. Dimir Control. Oh yeah. I've been waiting so long to see if we could find a viable control deck in this format, and if anything's going to do it, it's my boy here, Oil Deep Gear Hulk. This card is so well positioned, chat. Like, this is a card, I just want to explain why this is so good. It's lifelink with ward on a 4/4, which means nowhere to run isn't doing anything. Its ETB is strong enough that you do not want to bounce it. Go for the Throat doesn't kill it, and any other removal spell they want to hit still has to play through the ward. So it can't be cheap. It's going to have to be something they spend a decent amount of mana on. Even Witchstalker Frenzy is a minimum of 2 mana, maximum of 5 to deal with this. This card's good. This card's really, really good, and they're going to have to kill it on impact, and it protects itself on impact because it takes the best card from their hand, which may be the removal spell to get rid of it. So this card, to me, best card in the set. I'm just calling it right now. Everybody else can disagree. That's fine. Go ahead and leave a comment if you disagree. But I'd say try out this list because it seems real spicy to me at the moment.
Yes, it does. And I suspect the price of that Oil Deep Gear Hulk is going to skyrocket once people figure it out. But yeah, that is the anti-bounce card. And I'm excited for it.
Absolutely. Now, I think that's everything we got for this show. Max, what you got on your end?
I just have to announce that next week we're going to be taking a break, right? We generally do that week 1 to see how the meta shakes out, see what the tournament results are, see what sort of threads and strategies are becoming popular, so we can bring that information to you. So we'll return to discuss the week 1 results the week after. In the meantime, best of luck to everyone and have fun at pre-release weekend.
We discussed quite a few cards from Aetherdrift that are worth getting revved up about, but I have placed a complete list of cards I recommend buying from the new set in my sideboard guide document, available now to Coffee and Grinders members. So other than that, please like, share, comment on this video, show support for your community. We appreciate having all of you here, and until next time, untap, upkeep, resist.